The sun hung mercilessly in the sky, a burning eye that hadn't blinked in months. The once lush fields of the village were now cracked and barren, each fissure in the earth a reminder of what had been lost. Crops had withered to dust, and the riverbeds were nothing but dry, winding scars across the land. The villagers moved like shadows, their eyes hollow, their hope as dry as the soil beneath their feet. Tao stood on the edge of his field, staring at the desolation. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and reached into his pocket, fingers curling around the last seed he had. He held it up, letting the sun's light catch it. A small, withered thing, but still alive. It was the last of his harvest from years ago, before the drought had begun its cruel reign. The other villagers had given up long ago. Some had left to seek work in faraway cities, while those who remained merely survived, their spirits drained by the unforgiving drought. Tao's wife, Mareka, stood beside him. Her voice was soft, tired, as she spoke.
Tao, we have to think of our children. This seed, it can't save us. It's better to keep it, to remind us of better days.
But Tao shook his head.
What use is a memory of hope if we don't fight for it?
Mareka sighed, looking out at the barren land.
No one will blame you if you let it go.
Behind them, a few villagers passed by, overhearing the conversation. One of them, old Aki, chuckled bitterly.
You're wasting your time, Tao.
He called out.
That seed will die in the ground, just like everything else. The land is cursed. Leave it be.
Tao's grip tightened around the seed. He knew the risks, the possibility that this tiny speck of life would never grow. But he also knew that without it, there was nothing left. His heart ached for the fertile fields of his youth, for the future he had promised his children. No, he couldn't give up. Not yet. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of red and orange, Tao knelt in the dirt. His hands, rough from years of labor, began to dig into the hard soil. Each scrape of his fingers felt like a battle against the earth itself. His children watched from the doorway of their small house, silent, their wide eyes filled with both curiosity and doubt. Mareka stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder.
Tao, you don't have to do this.
But he only nodded and whispered.
I do.
With a reverence usually reserved for prayer, he placed the seed into the small hole he had dug. The ground was dry, resisting his efforts, but Tao pressed the seed down gently, covering it with a thin layer of soil. He stood up slowly, his knees creaking with age and weariness, and looked at the patch of earth where he had buried his last hope. The villagers, still watching from a distance, shook their heads and muttered to themselves as they walked away. To them, Tao was a fool, a man clinging to dreams in a world that had no more room for them. But Tao stood tall. His eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something rare in the village: belief. He looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to pierce through the fading daylight. The ground was still dry, the sky still clear, but Tao's heart told him that miracles were born from the seeds of courage. And so, he waited, trusting that the earth would remember how to give life, even when everyone else had forgotten. The days stretched on, each one hotter than the last. Tao woke every morning to the same dry air, the same sun-scorched earth, and the same silence. The village, once filled with the chatter of farmers, was now eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of a wandering breeze that kicked up dust. Each morning, Tao walked out to the small patch of soil where he had planted the seed. He knelt down, running his fingers over the surface, searching for any sign of life. But the ground was still, no sprout, no hint of green, only the parched earth staring back at him. His neighbors had grown accustomed to this strange ritual. They watched from a distance as Tao checked on his patch of land, muttering to themselves as they passed by. Some laughed softly, shaking their heads. Others pitied him. They had all been farmers once too. They knew the heartbreak of watching their crops die, and they couldn't understand why Tao refused to accept the reality they had all come to terms with. One afternoon, as Tao knelt by his seed once again, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Aki, the village elder, standing over him. The old man leaned on his cane, his face etched with the lines of age and hardship.
"You're wasting your time, Tao,"
Aki said, his voice a low, raspy drawl.
"The rain hasn't come in months. It's not going to come now. That seed of yours, it's not magic. It can't grow in this."
Tao looked up at the elder, his hands still resting in the dirt. He had heard this speech before, not just from Aki, but from almost everyone in the village. And yet, despite the doubt that clung to their words, something inside Tao refused to let go.
I know the odds.
Tao replied quietly, his eyes fixed on the small patch of earth.
But this seed, it's all I have left. I have to try.
Aki shook his head, a weary smile crossing his lips.
Trying doesn't always mean succeeding. Sometimes you just have to know when to give up.
Tao said nothing as the old man turned and walked away. His words lingered, though, settling in the back of Tao's mind like an unwanted guest. What if Aki was right? What if everyone was right? Days had passed since he planted the seed, and the sky remained as clear as ever. Not a single cloud had drifted over the village in weeks, and the heat only grew more intense with each passing day. That night, Tao sat outside his small home, staring up at the stars. His children were asleep inside, and Mareka was sitting quietly beside him. She hadn't said much since he planted the seed. She was loyal, supportive, but the worry on her face was undeniable. She too had her doubts.
Tao,
Mareka said softly, breaking the silence.
I don't want to see you get hurt.
I know.
He whispered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he was willing to let go of this dream. But Tao couldn't. Not yet.
It's been days.
Mareka continued, her voice barely above a whisper.
The rain isn't coming. Maybe we should.
Just a little longer.
Tao interrupted, his tone more firm than he had intended. He sighed and softened his voice.
Please, just a little longer.
Mareka didn't argue. She simply nodded and rested her hand on his, her fingers warm and comforting in the cool night air. The next morning, Tao returned to his field once more. He knelt beside the patch of earth, his knees sinking into the dirt. He ran his fingers over the soil again, hoping for even the smallest sign that the seed had taken root. But there was nothing. He sighed deeply, his chest tight with frustration and doubt.
Was this all for nothing? Was Aki right? Was everyone right?
He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. For the first time, he felt the urge to give up, to walk away from the barren patch of soil and accept what everyone had already accepted. That the land was dead, that the rain wasn't coming, and that no amount of hope could change that. But just as Tao was about to rise, a low rumble echoed in the distance. His eyes snapped open, and he glanced toward the horizon. There, far off in the distance, a dark line of clouds was forming, slowly rolling toward the village. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. Tao's heart quickened. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the sky. Could it be? After all this time? The villagers too began to notice. They stopped in their tracks, pointing to the clouds as they gathered in the sky. Whispers filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, the village was alive with movement. Tao stood in his field, watching the clouds inch closer, their dark shadows a stark contrast to the bright sunlit sky. His breath caught in his throat as he felt a single drop of rain land on his cheek. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The rain began slowly, as if testing the land's resolve. A single drop, then another, until soon a light drizzle danced across the village. The dry earth hissed and sizzled as it drank the water, greedily absorbing every drop. Tao stood still, his eyes lifted to the sky, letting the rain soak into his skin. It was real. The rain had come. The villagers emerged from their homes, staring in disbelief at the sky, their faces turned upward to feel the cool, refreshing rain against their parched skin. Whispers of awe floated through the air, voices filled with surprise and wonder. Even Aki, the village elder, stood outside his door, watching as the clouds gathered overhead, heavier now, pouring their blessing upon the earth. For hours, the rain fell. It soaked into the cracked ground, softening it, turning dust into mud. Tao's field, once lifeless and barren, seemed to breathe again, the soil dark and rich with promise. But even as the rain continued, Tao's eyes remained fixed on that one small patch of land, where his last seed lay buried beneath the surface. He knelt beside it, gently pressing his hand into the wet soil, feeling the cool dampness between his fingers. For the first time in weeks, his heart was light. A few days passed, and the sun returned, though not as fierce as before. The ground, still wet from the rainfall, shimmered in the morning light. Tao woke early, as he had done every day since he planted the seed, and made his way to the field. His breath caught as he knelt down beside the small patch of land. There, pushing its way through the soil, was a small, delicate green sprout. Tiny but vibrant, it stood as a symbol of life where there had been only death. Tao stared at the sprout, tears welling in his eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, brushing his fingers over the tender leaves, careful not to disturb the fragile growth. It was real. The seed had sprouted. His children, running out to the field to find him, saw the sprout and gasped.
"Father, look! It's growing!"
They cried, their voices filled with excitement. Marika followed close behind, her eyes wide with amazement as she knelt beside Tao, the disbelief on her face turning into a radiant smile.
It worked.
She whispered, tears in her eyes.
You were right.
The news spread quickly. Soon the entire village gathered at Tao's field, standing in awe around the small sprout. The same neighbors who had doubted him, the same ones who had called him foolish, now marveled at the sight. They whispered to one another, their voices filled with hope. Aki, the elder, approached Tao, his eyes fixed on the little plant. His face, usually stern and weathered, softened as he spoke.
I was wrong, Tao. You showed us all that the land still remembers how to live. You believed when none of us did.
Tao nodded humbly, his eyes still on the sprout.
It wasn't just the seed,
He said softly.
it was the waiting, the hoping, even when it seemed impossible. Sometimes, the hardest part is holding on when everyone else lets go.
The villagers, inspired by Tao's success, began to work together, preparing their fields once again. They tilled the soil, planted new seeds, and waited with renewed hope. The rains, though sparse, returned more frequently, and soon the village was alive with the green of new crops. Weeks later, Tao's single sprout had grown into a strong, healthy plant. It bore fruit, enough to feed his family and share with the village. It wasn't just a plant, it was a promise, a reminder that life could return, even in the harshest conditions. Tao stood in his field, the land around him now green with new life. The village, once filled with despair, was now buzzing with activity as crops began to grow again. Tao's heart swelled with pride, not for the fruit of his labor, but for the courage it had taken to keep believing when all hope had seemed lost. As he walked through the field, his children running ahead, Tao smiled. He had learned something precious. Perseverance is not just about waiting for things to get better. It's about believing in the possibility of change, even when the odds seem impossible. It's about planting that last seed, even when the world tells you it's hopeless, because miracles don't happen overnight. They are the result of faith, patience, and unwavering resolve. Tao's story was a lesson for the village, and for all who heard it. No matter how barren the land, no matter how hopeless the situation, there is always a seed of courage waiting to grow. You just have to plant it.